Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and my co-host this week is Jim, but not the Jim you were expecting. New Jim, tell us all about yourself.
Hello, it's nice to be invited on to the podcast. My name is Jim Allenby. You may have heard me before. I've been on a few hamster podcasts. I've been on a Dave Rennie podcast, and I also have my own podcast, which is called What's in the Box.
Dave is a good friend. I did Tomb of the Cybermen for his show last year, and I will be recording a new episode with him early in 2025. Which stories have you done for Dave?
I did Knock Knock, which was my first. I also did Arc of Infinity.
Ooh. And
it used to be one of my favorites, but after kind of doing a deep dive into it, I kind of gone off it a bit now. And I did Delta and the Bannermen as well, which is absolutely one of my favorites.
Delta is a story that's coming up on this podcast soon because the novelization comes out close in time to the Smugglers. So I'll have a lot of positive things to say about that as well. Arc of Infinity was not my first, but it was the first Doctor Who story where I saw the cliffhanger. So Arc of Infinity Part 2 was one of those signal moments in my early fandom. And I also love that story for a very long time. And I will still defend it. But if you rank every Doctor Who story in quality from A to Z or A to Z, Arc of Infinity is more of an S or a T than a B or a C, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. It's I think it's one of those stories that it appealed to me more as a kid because I first saw it as a kid on VHS video, and it's only over the years where I've kind of watched it with a bit more of a critical eye, which is, sometimes we shouldn't do that, but sometimes, we can't help but doing that. That I've come to realize that probably the only bits that I really like from it are the Amsterdam scenes.
The Time Lord stuff was very exciting for me when I was a brand new fan, but after you see every other classic series Gallifrey story out there, it's not one of the more intriguing ones. So I remember when I was still on Twitter, I remember you launching What's in the Box.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember you posting about it. And then very shortly after that, I deleted Twitter and left it and took the app off my phone. And I've been hiding out on Blue Sky ever since. And it's only in the last couple of weeks, after Musk helped buy the U.S. election, that everybody seems to be leaving Twitter. And now Blue Sky, over the last couple of weeks, has been exploding. So I came to your podcast fairly late in the day because I wasn't on Twitter anymore when you were promoting the earlier episodes. But our mutual friend Conrad, I listened to his appearance on your show a couple of months ago, and that was a big eye-opener for me. So I certainly reached out to you very soon after that when my original guest for the Smugglers became unavailable. So I'm very happy that you were here on fairly short notice.
You've smuggled me in.
And you're fired. So for the uninitiated, what is What's in the Box about? What's your format, and how long has it been running?
Okay, so it's just over a year ago that I started it up, and it was originally planned as a podcast where you would discuss your journey into Doctor Who, and you would pick your favourite TV show, classic and new Who, your favourite audio story, favourite novel, and favourite comic strip. But I soon kind of realised that actually not everybody has read the books, or not everybody has read comics or listened to audio, so I didn't want to exclude people from that. So I basically threw the doors open and said, come on, give us a brief discussion about your journey into Doctor Who, and then tell us what some of your favorite things are. So that could be anything. It could be TV stories, favorite Dalek designs, favorite cliffhangers, favorite pieces of music, favorite doctors, companions, stunt men, stunt women, anything at all. We usually stick to about 3 or 4 selections, although one or two people have gone up to about 7 or 8. And it's basically just gives people a chance to come on and talk about anything they want to talk about with regards to Doctor Who that they really enjoy about the show. That's kind of where it began, really.
I will tell you that the very first time that I ever watched Doctor Who, and this is, PBS is a network of local publicly funded stations, and growing up in the New York City suburbs, I had access to 5 or 6 different PBS stations. So the local station that was originating in Nassau County, New York, Long Island, a few miles from where I grew up, Channel 21, they were showing Doctor Who, and they were up to the Peter Davison era. And 2 of my school friends had been watching it on Channel 21 since they got the show about 9 months earlier. So they had started with Tom Baker and gone all the way through, and they were urging me to watch. So I figured out from the Broad WCast website, the very first episode that I saw any part of was Time Flight Part 1. I watched about 90 seconds of it. It's the scene where the Doctor goes from the bridge of the Concorde into the TARDIS console. It would have aired on November 23rd, 1984. That would have been the first time that I watched any Doctor Who at all. The coincidence is that you and I are recording this the day before this episode gets pushed out. We are recording this on Doctor Who's 61st anniversary. So today is November 23rd, 2024. That means today, Jim, in case you didn't know it, today is the 40th anniversary of my discovering Doctor Who. Now, It took me a while to become a fan because PBS would show 25 minutes a night. So Monday, November 23rd, 1984 would have been Time Flight Part 1. I did not turn Channel 21 back on for another week until Monday the 30th, when they would have shown Arc of Infinity Part 2, where I watched the cliffhanger. Then I tuned in a couple of days later for Arc of Infinity Part 4. I managed to miss Snake Dance entirely, saw bits of Modron Undead. I managed to miss Terminus entirely. So Enlightenment Part 1 I would have seen in the beginning of December 1984. Once I saw the Enlightenment Part 1 cliffhanger, I never voluntarily missed a Doctor Who episode ever again. That was the moment that I realized, okay, this is the show that was made for me and me alone. And I'm only 11 years old, and there was a lot of other good TV that I was missing. But that was the moment when Doctor Who became part of my DNA. 40 years later, I've been doing a weekly podcast about it for more than 3 years. So I guess whatever it is, it worked.
Yeah, I mean, that is a pretty good cliffhanger, anyway, isn't it? So I can kind of see how you would have been hooked into that as an 11-year-old. And some of the cliffhangers that we discussed it on the podcast. Now, who did I discuss it with? I can't remember. Forgive me, because I've had quite a few guests on talk about quite a few different things. But, sometimes pinning down those cliffhangers, there are so many of them, to actually to come up with a favorite one is a tough call. But, there's a lot of them out there. And I really, I can see how that one would have hooked you in. It is the one with Turlo jumping off the edge of the boat, isn't it?
That's not a bad one, but that is the part 2 cliffhanger.
Oh.
The part 1 cliffhanger was reenacted by Russell T Davies' Lock, Stock, and Barrel as the cold open for Voyage of the Damned. So you spend 24 minutes thinking that you're on an Edwardian racing yacht.
Yes,
and then the Doctor looks at the map and he realizes the marker buoys aren't marker buoys, they're planets. And then the electronic viewer opens on an Edwardian yacht, and it turns out they're in space. And that moment, I mean, it just knocked my socks off. 11 years old. I'd been watching cartoons and kids shows a month earlier, and all of a sudden this was the most sophisticated thing I'd ever seen. And the rest of Enlightenment is incredible. Once Linda Barron shows up, I mean, she captivated me, mesmerized me. But everything about Enlightenment is just a gorgeous, gorgeous story, and I'm lucky to have discovered it so early on in my fandom.
How do you feel about the reimagined version of Enlightenment that we got on the DVD many, many years later?
This is a story that I've told many times in many places, but I've never told it to you. I started collecting the Target books about 2 months into my fandom, so January 1985. My school friend, John, still a very good friend all these years later, he started collecting the targets first, and he would bring them to school. And on lunch breaks, I read, half of Legopolis, half of Invasion of Time. I started reading the books on my own. And of course, reading the books, watching the TV, reading the books, watching the TV. Very, very soon, I started marking off the cliffhangers inside the books. And I started marking in the book what was different from the TV. So like for the demons, somebody says 1959 on TV. In the book, it's written as 1939. I actually took a pencil and made the change in the book, that sort of thing. When I got the Enlightenment book, I realized that the Part 3 cliffhanger was missing. And the Part 3 cliffhanger is just a wonderfully over-the-top acted bit of direct-to-camera, villain talking to the camera, Part 3, unique to Part 3 cliffhanger.
Oh, Doctor, you're such a fool. Did you really think your ephemeral mind could defeat me? Lost. All that awaits is your ultimate destruction.
And when you get to the book, the cliffhanger's not there. So I wrote it in pencil. I took a pencil, and I couldn't remember by the time I got upstairs to my books, I couldn't remember the entire line. So I just wrote in pencil, "You fool, Doctor," said Rack. "All that will result is your destruction," which isn't even half of what she says, but I had to have it in the book somehow written, and it's still there, written at the bottom of the page with an arrow linked back to where it should have been in the text. When you get to the 60-minute TV edit, which comes out about 15 years ago, the Part 3 cliffhanger is not there. So that was it. I've never watched that bit again. It's just not necessary for me to watch the cut down when I enjoy the original so much. Which brings us to our next action item for this conversation, because as we sit here, you and me, Jim, on the 61st anniversary, earlier today, we got news that they are releasing, a month from now, December 23rd, 2024, they are releasing a 90-minute colorized, partially reconstructed version of the War Games. So the War Games is now going to be in color. It's going to be reduced to a 90-minute movie, and they have discovered the original film trims. So instead of the telecine transfers, they are now going to be able to use the actual original film, and it's going to be a proper HD production rather than vid-fired or remastered or what have you. And they have created a regeneration for the Patrick Troughton Doctor into, depending on which conspiracy theorists you ask, either going to regenerate into John Pertwee or perhaps the Joe Martin Fugitive Doctor. And you actually see a little bit of the regeneration in the trailer. Let's play a little bit of the trailer right now and see what it sounds like.
5 escaped prisoners traveling in a 1917 British Army ambulance, clearly marked with a red cross.
Time travelers.
Right this way!
I wonder.
I've heard disquieting rumors of serious trouble here. Are they true?
You know what will happen?
Your appearance has changed before. It will change again.
Goodbye, Jamie.
No! You can't do this to me! No!
I've only known you face to face for about 15 minutes. I don't know much of what you think about the Patrick Troughton era and the War Games. What do you think of the War Games as a 10-episode serial, and what do you think of this idea as a 90-minute color movie with new special effects and a brand new scene?
As for the War Games itself, it's a story that it was never one of my favourite Patrick Troughton stories. I always enjoyed it when I watched it, but I often felt it was quite long, and it didn't seem to get that much love from what I remember at the time when I was a kid. The older I've got, the more interested I've become in the story. I think it's it's a really powerful piece of TV, really. I mean, say what you want about the fact there's a lot of loop stories in there and there's a lot of repetition, which I think will make it easy to cut it down. I don't envy the task of whoever's done that, but it's one of those stories that it seems to be famous for its last couple of episodes rather than the rest of it, but there is a lot to enjoy within those preceding 8 episodes. I think there's some fantastic performances in it. I mean, often when I go into the start of the story, I always think, it doesn't feel like this is a final story. It feels epic enough to be a finale, but it doesn't often feel like this is going to be the last Troughton story because he's still on fine form. It feels like he's part of. How can I word this rightly? It feels like he is still in full flow, that it's not coming to the end of his tenure. We'll look at the Hartnell era a little bit later, but it feels very different from the end of the Hartnell era. This feels like a Doctor who could still go on and do more. And I just find it a really interesting piece of TV. I think it's. I'll give you this as an example then, because I've recently been doing the Doctor Who pilgrimage. I've been rewatching it all from the start.
Oh wow!
And I'm currently up to what I'm watching. Watching Warriors Gate tonight, so I'm quite far on now.
I envy your Warriors Gate journey. That's a bang.
I know. I can't wait to rewatch that tonight. But when it came to watching the War Games. Before it, obviously, I'd watched the recon of the Space Pirates, which is a struggle. And it took me 4 nights to get through 6 episodes of the Space Pirates. And I watched the War Games in 2 nights. And that's 10 episodes. So, that says it all. I mean, I know it's easier because you've got the visuals, so you can see what's actually in front of you. But it's not a story that ever kind of lets up. It doesn't sag, even when we are doing those loop stories. It's still quite it's still busy. It's still keeping you entertained, and it's never boring.
I did my pilgrimage, and it was the first time I'd ever watched all of Doctor Who exactly in order, starting in October 2020 as part of my ongoing lockdown rewatch projects. So I plugged in the first 2 episodes of Unearthly Child, October 26th, 2020. I created my Twitter hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, which had only been used once before by somebody who started the pilgrimage and gave up after 2 days. So I reclaimed the hashtag, and I made it all the way through the classic series in 14 months, ending in November 2021, with a couple of breaks here and there as I was waiting for new DVDs to come out. Like I paused to wait for the Faceless Ones DVD to come out. I paused to wait for season 8 to come out on Blu-ray. But I did 2 episodes a night, the whole Megillah in 14 months. The first part of that pilgrimage where I really struggled was Patrick Troughton seasons 5 and 6, beginning with Abominable Snowmen, which was the first time in the pilgrimage that a story that I had liked really cratered in my estimation, because there's a lot about Abominable Snowmen that is garbage, some of which has been fixed by the animation, but it was disappointing watching that over 3 nights. And then you get to the end of production season 5, beginning of TV season 6, you have Wheel in Space, Dominators. Obviously, different guests on my show, like Fraser and Andrew Smith, are much bigger fans of the Dominators than I am. Hey guys. But for me, that was a definite dip in quality during the pilgrimage. Seeds of Death has some problems before Terrence Dix comes in on episodes 4, 5, and 6 and rewrites the back half of the story and makes it better. And Space Pirates is almost Doctorless Who, right? Because the TARDIS doesn't show up until 17 minutes into episode 1. That's unforgivably long. The Doctor and Jamie and Zoe don't speak to another character and exchange dialogue with another character until episode 3. And then episode 6, they're not even there in studio. They only appear by pre-filmed inserts because they were off on location for the War Games. So everyone shows up in studio for Space Pirates Part 6 except for the 3 leads. So the whole story feels very inconsequential. And then you add to the fact that the bad guy in the story, the one episode that survives, episode 2, he's not even in.
No.
So Cavan is almost an absence, and he's probably the least charismatic villain that Doctor Who ever had, with the possible exception of Trask and the Highlanders. But then you come to the War Games. Now, the War Games was never supposed to be 10 episodes long. It was supposed to be 6. But the guys who were making Doctor Who at that time, the producer and script editor, didn't take the show in 1969 as seriously as we fans are taking it here in 2024. For them, it was a day job, and according to Terrence Dix, they spent most of their time down the pub. Season 6 is a story of a show falling apart. Stories are canceled left and right. The only reason the War Games is 10 episodes is because they would have been airing a test pattern card for 4 of those weeks if the War Games hadn't been expanded out. Luckily, the guys who wrote it are pros, Terrence and Malcolm. If you watch the War Games night by night, you will notice that they introduce a new wrinkle to the mystery in every episode. So you've got a TV screen in episode 1, and then it escalates until you get to the War Game, the War Chief's planet, and then you meet a new villain in every episode. You meet the War Chief, the Security Chief, and then finally the War Lord. It's very carefully structured, even though there's a lot of capture, escape, capture loops, and even though there's this weird twist where Smythe is the big bad in episodes 1, 2, and 3, and then comes back 4 episodes later and is promptly killed off. That's a bit of an odd structure. But each episode very carefully builds on the one before, and David Maloney is one of the best directors the classic series had. Episode 1 begins with the Doctor and Jamie and Zoe standing in a war zone in a puddle of mud giggling. 25 minutes later, they're facing a firing squad, and the episode ends with an actual bullet sounding off. A trick that Robert Holmes later recycles for Caves of Androzani Part 1, speaking of great cliffhangers. This is a very carefully made story, and it just gets more and more intense as it goes. Episodes 9 and 10 are two of the best half hours Doctor Who did in the entire 1960s. So War Games, even though there's a lot of it, I think it's very, very well made, and they're doing the best they can, considering that most of it was written in one weekend, consuming pots and pots of coffee, if not something stronger. So, to make a long story short, a 90-minute cut down War Games is going to lose a lot of texture that makes the 10-part story so fun to watch. But I think if you cut out all the fat and get rid of all the capture, escape, capture loops, this really could be, in a way that the Daleks cut down was not, it really could be white-knuckle television without any dull moments or wasted scenes. It might just be 90 minutes of absolute honest-to-goodness two-fisted action. So I'm very cautiously optimistic about this.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, I said a couple of days ago, actually, to my friend, we're not going to get any more colorizations. This is it now. It was an experiment. I think people are hoping for these things, and we're not going to get them. And then, lo and behold, 2 days later, they announced the War Games. Now, I think it's always difficult with watching these kind of cut down versions, and colorizations aside, watching cut down versions is really difficult because you are so used to what the story is like anyway. And I found that so hard with watching the Daleks. And I'm intrigued to know what a new viewer would feel coming into watching something like the Daleks or the War Games as a cut down version, because they will have not seen that original to make the comparisons. So I may do a bit of a test with a non-Doctor Who friend to see if they see what their reaction is to the cut down version of the War Games. But as an experiment, I'm really interested in it. I mean, you see a lot of people getting upset that they've cut so much out of it, but it's not a replacement. It's a different variation of a story. It's never going to replace the original. It's an interesting experiment, and that's the way I go into it. And also it's great to see some of these scenes that we've seen for years and years and years recolorized as well. Colorized.
If you read the info text, the pop-up production notes on the War Games DVD, which has come out about 17 years ago by now, those production notes take very careful care to mention you are watching a black and white program, but it was filmed in a color studio. And these are the colors that the War Games actually was, what the actors are reacting against. It was very day glow. So seeing the colorization on the YouTube trailer, which I've played the audio of earlier, it looks phenomenal. The War Lord's glasses are tinted. Those goggles they wear on the Warlord's planet are tinted. It looks really cool.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, you and I have kids who were born in the 21st century. Younger children don't have the ability to process TV the way that we do. For them, a 10 by 25 minute serial is going to be almost as bad for us as our parents' 1930s movie serials were. They're just not going to be able to, because TV isn't made that way anymore. So seeing it as a 90-minute cut down in color with newer music might be a way to get kids into the classic series as a gateway. I know my kid struggles with the classic series. I watched part 4 of Celestial Toymaker right before the giggle. She really enjoyed the giggle, but part 4 of Celestial Toymaker, she was like, this is terrible. And she doesn't see it the way that I see it. 21st century kid doesn't watch a lot of black and white. It just doesn't make sense to her. Plus the pacing is all off. So this could be a way of getting new kids to love the classic series.
Yeah, and why not? My son, he's 7 now, but I tried to show him. I thought which he likes Daleks. He actually likes the image of a Dalek, and he likes the new series. So I was like, well, what can I introduce him to with the classic series? And I thought, well, Planet of the Daleks is a pretty kind of a bright, colourful story to show him, but he was not interested in that first episode because there were no Daleks. So it was literally, I thought, right, okay, we'll just go to like a middle episode and he can just watch an episode with the Daleks. And that seemed to work because it was a shorter kind of shorter span. He wasn't watching an entire 2.5 hour story.
See, for me, my very first Dalek story would have been Resurrection, which would have aired pretty early on in my PBS run. And that is a great story for an 11-year-old boy to watch in 1984 because there's a lot of death, there's a lot of murder, there's a lot of treachery, and the Daleks are pretty terrifying in that story in a way they hadn't been in a very long time in Doctor Who. They do terrible things. I just can't imagine that Planet of the Daleks as a 6 by 25 serial is going to work for a 21st century child. But I'm glad to hear that that's not actually the case.
Only one episode.
Only one episode, yes. So now, of course, we come to November 23rd. Now, those of you who tuned in for the Smugglers, I promise we're getting to the Smugglers, but this is an anniversary show. We're going to take our time and go the long way around. When would you first have seen An Unearthly Child, and how do you think it holds up today as a bit of television?
So the first time I saw An Unearthly Child would have been the pilot version when it was broadcast on, I'm sure it was BBC Two in the very early 90s, and my dad had recorded it. So I would have been about 9 or 10 years old, and it was shown as part of I don't know if it was like an evening or an afternoon of celebrating BBC or something. I can't remember the context of it, but they broadcast the pilot episode. And so for many years, that's all I had until I picked up a VHS version of it. Of course, that first episode is it's a piece of magic. I never get bored when I watch it. It just, even now, I think it stands up because it's so. I mean, I can only imagine what people thought at the time when they first saw that Doctor Who, and how they felt about the kind of the weirdness of it all and the strangeness. And I think the first episode holds up really, really well. As for the rest of the story, I've changed my opinion on it over the years because I used to think it was it was a slog to get through. It was really, dull. It was just a load of cavemen grunting. But now I think it's a really quite powerful piece of drama, kind of showcasing these people and their descent into absolute terror at the situation that they've been put into. Whether or not it would stand up these days to, again, a 21st century audience, I'm not sure. Interestingly, my co-worker's daughter, who I believe is 14, has been given the assignment to watch An Unearthly Child by her media production teacher, I believe. Apparently she watched the first episode, and I said to my friend, my co-worker, I said, are you sure that it's the original series classic and it's not Rose? It says no, she's mentioned a grumpy old man, a police box in a junkyard, and apparently she is hooked. So whether or not she's got to the cavemen episode yet, I don't know, but I'm intrigued to find out whether or not she will kind of follow that journey onwards. I basically said if you can get through the cavemen episodes, then you're probably going to stick with the rest of it.
Just be careful, because the new series story, The Caretaker, is also a grumpy old man in a police box in a junkyard. So make sure she's not watching The Caretaker. The same junkyard, in fact. So just to briefly give a 45-second version of my Unearthly Child episode, the novelization of Unearthly was one of the second batch of novelizations that I bought, February 1985. So I read that very early on, and I had all the caveman stuff read when I was a brand new baby fan. And like I said, with 5 or 6 PBS stations available to me in New York, the Hartnell episode started airing on New Jersey Network in September 1985. So they aired the entire 4-part story as a movie omnibus when I'd been a fan for less than a year. So I videotaped it, I watched it, and I was hooked and I was mesmerized. And then when I was dating a woman in the late 90s who was interested in watching the very beginning of Doctor Who, I showed her the 4-part story. She thought it was awful nonsense, so clearly didn't work for her, and the relationship didn't last very long, although not because of Doctor Who. When I watched part 1 again for my Twitter pilgrimage, and of course the tweets are no longer there because I deleted my account. I have them saved to a external hard drive somewhere. When I backed up my Twitter before I deleted it. I have the tweets somewhere. But the point is, episode 1 of Unearthly is the perfect bit of television, because Waris Hussein is not some jaded old TV director saying, here, have your children's show, I'm going down to the pub. He's, like Verity Lambert, a young radical in his 20s. And just scene by scene, shot by shot, in those first 25 minutes alone, you have POV tracking shots. You have live in-studio flashbacks. You have the camera as Ian Chesterton yelling at Susan. And that is an image so good that Stephen Moffat recycled it lock, stock, and barrel, shot for shot, in Let's Kill Hitler, which is River Song's origin story, almost 40 years later in 2011. So, and then you have the TARDIS set, you have the eerie sound effects, the 4 actors performing almost like a black box play. The last 10 minutes of Unearthly is incredible to watch. Every line of dialogue sizzles. William Russell, Jacqueline Hill, William Hartnell, Carol Ann Ford nail every single bit. Then you have the time travel bit with the opening graphics playing over the characters' faces. And then all of a sudden you're on a prehistoric plane and a shadow is looming over the TARDIS and the credits start to roll. You name any 25 minutes in Doctor Who that is a technical bit of television, better than those 25 minutes technically. It is just, there's not a wasted moment in it. When I watch those 25 minutes, not only as a Doctor Who fan, but as a amateur student of television, I just love watching that being made. And most Doctor Who stories after that were not nearly so well directed, but those first 25 minutes are genius as written, and genius as directed, and genius as acted. And if that's the start of your pilgrimage, that's going to carry you a long way past a lot of the doldrums coming up in the future, because that is a heck of a start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it packs so much into it, and it's so innovative. And every time I watch it, I get that excitement. It's just fantastic. Actually, tonight's the first time I haven't watched it on the anniversary day, so I might have to squeeze that in after Warriors Gate later on.
And in terms of how young people react, I will tell you that in 2013, the Paley Center here in New York City, formerly known as the Museum of TV and Radio, the director here is a big Doctor Who fan, so he did several Doctor Who screenings at Paley Center in 2012, 2013. So I was there when he showed the DVD of Spearhead from Space in 2012. I was one of the older folks in the audience. People were gobbling it up, especially when there's a sign on the door that says doctors only. And Pertwee looks into the camera and then back at the sign, and everyone cracked up laughing. I'd never even noticed that before as a psych gag, but it really works when you watch it in a group. So then in January 2013, they brought in Waris Hussein, and he actually did a live commentary over part 1 of Unearthly Child. And then he did an onstage interview. And I was sitting in the overflow room, mostly kids in their 20s who were there because of the new series, and they loved it, and they were howling. And then they showed the entire 4-part story a couple of weeks later on a Saturday afternoon. I went, so when you're watching Doctor Who in a group, it's always better than watching it alone. And young people, at least young people 10 years ago, really ate this stuff up.
Yeah.
And that brings us from 1963, the first story in season 1, to The Smugglers, the final story of the season 3 production block, and really the last moment where William Hartnell is the star of his own show. Jim, when did you first encounter The Smugglers in any format, and what was your reaction to it?
So I think the first time I encountered The Smugglers was back in the mid-90s. We would have like kind of sci-fi market fairs in our town hall, and there was a dealer there who was selling the missing episode soundtracks on cassette, and they were not narrated, so there was no, there was nothing on there. You didn't know what was going on. And I remember buying The Smugglers and trying to listen to it and not really kind of getting the gist of what was going on. So I kind of pushed it to the side. But then I remember seeing the telesnaps that had been published in Doctor Who magazine in the mid-90s as well, and reading the archive, which was in Doctor Who magazine. And that was about it up until the CD was released in the early noughties, I want to say. Narrated by, I think it was Annika Wills. It would have been Annika Wills who narrated it. So that was the first time really that I properly experienced the story, was listening to the Lost soundtrack.
I have a similar experience. I was in law school, which is 3 years in the mid to late 1990s. My first year, I didn't have a television. So my only creative outlet was the internet, regards Doctor Who. But, the first year of law school, you're working, reading. Not a lot of time for pleasure. The second year, I finally got a TV. And then it turns out I had a Doctor Who fan friend who lived right up the road in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He would drive down a couple of times a year to see me and show me a whole bunch of sci-fi merchandise. He would show me some old school Doctor Who stuff. He was big into Babylon 5, which was new at that time. He showed me some Blake 7, which I had never seen before. I'd have never seen again. But he brought me the off-air audio tapes for The Smugglers. So I would have been listening to them one episode a night, probably in the middle of final exams. Smugglers Part 1 is one of those great Hartnell format where the story opens inside the TARDIS, and the lead actors spend the next 20 minutes narrating every inch of scenery as they encounter it. So it's a very easy story to understand on audio. So I was delighted by it. And then, of course, I had final exams. I moved on to other things, left Ohio, moved back to New York. Then I discovered Napster. And on Napster, this was probably 1999, 2000, I was able to get every one of the missing audios from the lost Hartnell and Troughton stories. So I try to listen to The Massacre, which makes no sense without narration and a script in front of you. I did the same for Marco Polo. So I listened to The Smugglers again. And I'll mention this later in the program when I'm doing my audio essay on the book. I thought that John Ringham from the Aztecs was playing the voice of Captain Pike. And I was imagining Tlatoxel as the bad guy in a second story, and I was loving every minute of it. Turns out he is actually playing somebody else and not Captain Pike. So when I listened to the audio again, I thought it was an amazing, wonderful thing. Now, I would have bought the novelization right here, close in time to when it came out in 1988. So I would have read this very early on. It would have went in one eye and out the other. Mm-hmm. But those two times listening to the soundtrack in the late 90s, possibly the year 2000, I really dug it. The problem is, and I'll come to this again in the audio essay after you leave, When you watch The Smugglers as part of the pilgrimage, it has great, aggressive, groundbreaking, game-changing science fiction, hard science fiction stories before and after it. When you watch it as part of the pilgrimage, The Smugglers is a sad little irrelevancy. So The Smugglers works individually, but it doesn't work in context. So when you watch it after War Machines, before 10th Planet, you're like, come on, get to the Cybermen. This is terrible. It is a really good story, but you can see why it killed the historical, because at that point, nobody wants to see people in fancy dress anymore. They want to see robots crushing through London, or robots stalking through the Antarctic, or Daleks exterminating people on the planet Vulcan, or whatever it's called. I think The Smugglers is a very underrated gem of a story, and there's some problems with it, and I'll talk about that in the text of the novelization. But I am a fan of The Smugglers, and I will defend The Smugglers even more ardently than I will Arc of Infinity.
I mean, I feel much the same about The Smugglers. It's one of those stories that if you watch it in the pilgrimage, you kind of want it out the way, because, like you say, you've had those hard science episodes or stories either side of it, but it's also not a story that you would choose to go and watch randomly in the day, like you would maybe put on Pyramids of Mars or The Five Doctors or whatever. Nobody sits there. Well, I say nobody sits there. I'm assuming nobody sits there and thinks, you know what, I'm going to watch tonight, The Smugglers. And of course it doesn't. We've lost the story as well. So when I say watch, I mean watching the reconstruction of it with the soundtrack, which is how I've recently experienced it and how I watched it through the pilgrimage. So yeah, it does feel like it's a bit dropped off from the end of season 3, and it's shoved at the start of season 4, and it's also pretty much forgotten about because of season 4 and being, this is Hartnell's, this is the end of Hartnell, this is Troughton. So it kind of it seems to get lost in the mix a little bit, much the same way as the Highlanders. I often find the Highlanders and the Smugglers are kind of like the last gasp of the historicals. But I think it's unfair to dismiss them, because I think that if we could bring it to life with an animation, possibly, I think there'd be more people who would appreciate it for what it is.
And The Smugglers is not supposed to be seen as blurry telesnaps, right? This was Doctor Who's first big week-long location shoot. And we do have some of the color film that survives in the form of home movies, but this would have been, when you're looking at a boat, there's actually a boat parked in the ocean. They're actually on location in Cornwall. This must have looked grand, to the extent that any film can look grand in 405 line resolution on a 13-inch TV inside of a 300-inch cabinet, which is the way TVs were made in 1966. Tiny little picture. But this must have been a lot of fun to watch in the wild, and we have been deprived of all that location footage, except, of course, for the stray surviving home movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also, I think if it existed, if people watched it, they'd see what a fantastic villain Pike is. And not only Pike, but it was Cherub this time that stood out to me on rewatching. Because how I did this is I watched an episode a night, and then I read the corresponding chapters to the episode straight after it. But Cherub and Pike are such a fantastic pair of villains, and they never get talked about in the same breath as Marcus Scarman or Omega or your kind of your classic villains. I mean, okay, they are a couple of pirates, and they're not going to stand out as the greats, but I think they give who is it who plays Pike? It's Michael Godfrey, isn't it?
Right. I thought it was John Ringham. It is in fact Michael Godfrey. Yeah,
and George A. Cooper as Cherub. I just think they're the standouts of the story for me.
And shout out to the Loose Cannon team. If you go to their Daily Motion channel, they have a lot of video interviews they took with George Cooper 25 years ago. And he has some very not safe for work, not appropriate for small children stories about the making of The Smugglers. And he had terrific recall 35 years later, or whenever they shot the interview. And he still looked like Cherub 35 years later, even more order the point. I think the best analogy in the classic series is Iron Gron and Blood Axe from Time Warrior. They have a similar dynamic. Brian Hales is not quite Robert Holmes, but these two do play off each other very well in The Smugglers. And Michael Godfrey has a terrific villain's voice as Pike, and it works very well as audio only. And since on Telesnap Recons it's primarily audio only, he really has the right voice for Captain Pike, and he sells it, even though we're deprived the cliffhanger of him smashing his hook into the tabletop in episode 1. So that's a really big plus to the story. And then the censor clips, the Australian censor clips, we didn't know these existed until the late 90s. The best parts of The Smugglers, paradoxically, are the only parts of the story that survive, because Australia cut them out and then saved the footage. So we have the death of Holy Joe Longfoot in part 1 and some of the fighting in part 4. Mm-hmm. So the best bits of the action are still there for us to enjoy.
Yeah, we've got the
5 seconds at a time.
Yeah, it's often quite exciting watching a photo reconstruction when all of a sudden the story bursts into life for about 2 seconds of Polly screaming or Jamaica being killed,
right.
And it's like, whoa, and then you're back to still images again. But I saw those censor clips in the late 90s as well. It's I got hold of them on, somebody sent us a video with them on, and it's nice to have that moving visual footage of what the story looked like. But yeah, it's just such a shame that it doesn't exist, because the one thing I find quite interesting about The Smugglers is Hartnell and how angry he is at the start of the story. I mean, he is very angry at Polly and Ben, in a way that I don't think we've seen him since, early on in the series. It's kind of like, I don't know if he was channeling William Hartnell's frustrations at the time, maybe, I don't know. But it's really kind of, it's very jarring to go from the War Machines into the Smugglers.
You can see that even though Innes Lloyd had a better relationship with Hartnell than John Wiles did, Hartnell spends the entirety of part 2 sitting in a chair on one set. So he has some sizzling dialogue against Captain Pike in part 2, and then he gets to show some cleverness in part 3 when he does the tarot card trick. But they still haven't given him a whole lot to do in the narrative. You put Patrick Troughton in a similar story about smugglers and illegal trading in the Highlanders, and Troughton is in there like Groucho Marx as an agent of chaos. Mm-hmm. Whereas Hartnell is once again a secondary figure in his own story. And this is right around the moment when he voluntarily left the show instead of being fired. And then he goes on holiday, comes back to do 10th Planet, and is written out at the end of 10th Planet. So this is his last hurrah. But even so, you can see that he's been sidelined and he's become not the main driver on his own show. When you're reading it in book form, none of that is evident, and his dialogue in the book crackles. But on TV, it's a much more melancholy vibe.
No, absolutely, and it's clearly a story that's kind of, it's almost like Polly and Ben are pushed to be the leads in much the same way that Peter Purvis was in season 3. Polly and Ben seem to be the driving. Well, not necessarily the driving forces behind it, because it feels like more of an ensemble piece with the rest of the cast, really. I think you see probably more of Cherub and Pike than you do of Hartnell in this, but it definitely feels like the story is being driven by the supporting characters and the companions rather than the Doctor, who just kind of seems to be off at the side.
Let me ask you, and this is an unscripted question, where do you rank Annika Wills among all the 1960s companions, going in chronological order from Carol Ann Ford through Wendy Padbury? If you take all the female companions, and I'll include Katarina and Sarah Kingdom in that for the sake of inclusivity, if you were to rank them from greatest to least effective, best to worst, where do you put Annika Wills as Polly? Putting my cards on the table, like William Hartnell in Part 3, I think she's one of the best.
I think she's definitely has some strong moments. I would, because it'd probably be Vicky and Zoe up at the top.
Yeah.
But I think just below would be Polly, because she's just, I mean, I say what you want about the Highlanders. I absolutely love her kind of agency that she has in the Highlanders. And okay, maybe she's mistreating Kirsty a little bit badly in that story, but she has something to do. And I often feel like I feel really sad when they write Polly and Ben out, because it just feels like they deserved so much more. But Polly often seems to be driving the stories rather than Ben. She seems like the stronger companion, I think, than Ben.
I'll come back to this in the audio essay. There's a couple of regrettable moments that are scripted for Annika Wills on television, which Terrence takes out of the book. So in the book, Polly has even more agency than on television. But Annika Wills is always at the center of the action, and she's always coming up with some scheme, whether it's dissolving the Cybermen with the aerosol nail polish, or whether it is, in this story, engineering a jailbreak, or in the Highlanders, raising guns and weapons for the Doctor. She's always in the thick of it. And Annika Wills, as an actress, brings so much joie de vivre to the proceedings. I can't look at Annika Wills and not be entertained. I'm always excited to see what Polly's going to do next, even in stories that I've watched 7 or 8 times.
Yeah, it often feels like Polly's the one that they focus on out of all of them. And when Jamie comes along as well, you kind of you feel like the Jamie and Ben's character is, or plot lines are not plot lines, but their role in the story is split between between Jamie and Ben, whereas Polly still retains a kind of a consistent level of story. She doesn't seem to lose anything when Jamie appears.
And they were, as you say, ushered out of the show pretty abruptly. They were actually let go several weeks before their contracts expired, so they don't get to stick around for bits of Evil of the Daleks. But the Annika Wills, especially as Polly, I think is tremendously underrated. And the Smugglers, where she is on screen with just Ben and not the Doctor for much of the story, I think is a tribute to how good she is. So we've talked about you and discovering Doctor Who. We've talked about your podcast, talking about different episodes here and there. Where do the novelizations fit in for you? When did you discover the novelizations? What are some of your favorites? And what did you think of this one?
Okay, so I've got a bit of a sad tale with regards to the novelizations. As a kid, I wasn't a big reader. However, I would pick up the occasional Target book, usually ones that I'd seen in charity shops, second-hand book shops, and I would sometimes I'd get family members give me give copies of them if they found them, and I kind of had quite a big collection of them, but I never kind of got round to reading. And that wasn't kind of a reflection on the Doctor Who novelizations. That was just me in general. I wasn't a big reader. I am now. But I remember reading The Chase when that came out, because it had the Daleks in it. And I remember Planet of the Daleks. There's a theme here. And Remembrance of the Daleks. So it was anything with the Daleks in, I would read. I kind of went through a phase when I was in my early 20s of thinking, well, I don't need these books because I have them on video or I have them on DVD. I really don't need a print version of them. which is the stupidest thing I've ever thought, because I gave them away to an ex-girlfriend's son, and I'm still friends with her, and I asked her a few months ago, does your son still have these books? And she was like, I don't think he does anymore, no. But there were copies of, there was Carnival of Monsters in there there was Logopolis, Castrovalva, the Demons. And, I stupidly assumed, despite reading Remembrance of the Daleks, I stupidly assumed that the books were direct retellings of the TV stories. I've since learned, kind of the more that I've got into Doctor Who literature, that actually that's not the case at all. So the other year I started to build my collection up a little bit, and I first started with some of the 60s books. So I went out and got the Mythmakers, bought that on eBay, the Ice Warriors, Marco Polo, some of the stories that we couldn't see. I thought, well, I'll plug some gaps in my collection. And then slowly but surely I've been obtaining copies of other books as well. So I kind of feel like I'm atoning a little bit for my mistake. And of course, I think it was the Curse of Fenric actually that drew me back in, because I kept that. That was one of the only ones that I kept, because it's one of my favorite TV stories. And it was reading the Curse of Fenric and seeing all the kind of the additional stuff that was added to the actual story that made me realize, actually, these are pretty good. And I that was the moment where I thought, what the hell have I done? so yeah, I started picking up Target books again, and I've got a nice little collection now. Nothing too big, but I'm hoping to add to it again.
If the novelizations were merely edited versions of the TV transcripts, no offense to James Blish, but his novelizations of the original Star Trek stories, which are cut down into 20-page short stories, are not nearly as memorable for me as the Targets, because the Targets have different authors. Each author puts a different spin on things. So a book that is written by Malcolm Hulke has very little in common with a book written by a Terrence Dix, with a book written by a Jerry Davis. They all focus on different things, and they all treat their TV origin stories with various levels of respect or disdain. When Terrence is writing a novelization and he doesn't like the TV story, like Meglos or Arc of Infinity, he makes it very clear that the TV story is garbage, and he's going to make fun of it left, right, and center. For a book like The Smugglers, and I'll get into this after the break, I think he really enjoyed typing out this script, and you can see him adding some of himself into the narrative, which he doesn't always do. Whereas again, with a book like Arc of Infinity, he's much more, I don't know what's going on here, so I'm not even going to try. And then, of course, you have the David Whittaker books, which are great departures. You have I would say about half of these Sylvester McCoy books take great liberties and elaborations with their TV forebears. So with the novelizations, like Forrest Gump's Box of Chocolate, you never know what you're going to get. And the fact that this podcast has gone on for 3 years now, talking about a book a week, again, if I was talking about any other line of fiction that didn't put quite so much attention in the books, I don't think the show would have lasted. But the Targets are so good and so different from the TV that there's always something to talk about.
And I think also, for a lot of fans, they were the in for fans, or rather the way of experiencing the show once it had been shown on TV, and you're never going to get to see it again, because we're never going to get episodes released on for us to buy and take home.
Right.
So this, it often, I mean, on my own podcast, talking to fans, a lot of their favorite things are the Target novelizations and how that they were able to re-experience that story. So it's definitely something that I regret, but what I'm enjoying now is rediscovering Doctor Who through these books, because I mean, I think it was a year ago, I read Battlefield by Mark Platt, which was just phenomenal. I mean, Battlefield, say what you want about the story. I enjoy the story, but the book was it expanded so much of that world. And it was like, and the Mythmakers as well. That was just such an amazing read that really I was kind of just sat there thinking, what the hell? Why did I ever get rid of these books?
That being said, when you posted on Facebook a while back a photo of like 20 novelizations coming in at once, I envy you that journey of discovery, because I finished my novelization collection in the 1990s. And apart from cover variants, I really have not added to it. Now, when I lost all my new adventures from the 1990s and rebuilt that collection, I had the same joy as the books came in the mail. But I wish I could go back in time and collect the targets again, because it was just so much fun getting them two at a time in the 1980s, finishing in the 90s, getting my last one or two missing copies at conventions in Chicago in 1996. So my collection has been completed now for 28 years, and I'm not going to start over, but it was so much fun to do. And I'm glad that you have the chance at least to rebuild your collection book by book and read them book by book.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing. I just have to find the time to read them now. In amongst everything, I've just actually started reading the 8th Doctor Adventures for the first time, so I'm kind of going to have to intersperse them. But I mean, as for the Smugglers, I think, I mean, it is kind of a more or less direct retelling of the script, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are bits, slight differences. But I think for somebody who has never experienced the Smugglers before, I think reading this along with listening to the soundtrack or watching the recon, I think you get a better idea of what this story was all about. And I really enjoyed reading this. It was straight to the point. It's Terrence, so I've read Terrence Dicks before, but it really feels like it helps to tell the story in a simple and effective way, and without we don't go into any backstories of the characters. We don't kind of get any of that kind of stuff that you would get with other stories, but as a telling of the story, I think it works really well.
And I will explore that in a little more detail when I record my audio essay after the break. You're right, Terrence doesn't add very detailed backstory to the characters, but he does go into the characters' thought process a lot, and it's a lot of fun when Terrence gets into somebody's head. But Jim, you're going to be taking your leave of us now. I do have in mind to bring you back for something else shortly, but where can we find you and your podcast online?
Okay, so I am still clinging to the remnants of Twitter for now, like Kate Winslet clinging to a piece of the Titanic. I am at Fractured Boy, so it's Fractured Boy with a K. I also have that's a private account. I also have a public account, which is What's in the Box 24, but I am in the process of spending more time on Blue Sky at the moment, and you can find me at Blue Sky at fracturedboy.bsky.social. The podcast, it's mainly on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you type in What's in the Box, Doctor Who What's in the Box, you should be able to find it. I'm probably about 70 episodes into it now, planning on coming up to a break at the end of this year, but hoping to be back with some new guests in February time.
Very good, and I will link to that in the show notes, and you and I already follow each other on Blue Sky, so there's no worries there. Jim, thank you so much for joining us on short notice today, and welcome to the Doctor Who literature family.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm pleased to be part of the gang.
They all say
This is Tim Trelaw.
This is David J. Howe.
I'm Peter Purvis.
I am Sadie Miller.
This is Lauren Cornelius.
Larry, it's Fraser.
For all things in the Doctor Who collecting world and beyond, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. I'm Larry Van Mersbergen, your host, and I've been collecting for 42 years. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature on the Direction Point Podcast Network. Keep turning the pages.
Doctor Who, The Smugglers by Terrence Dicks, televised as The Smugglers, teleplay by Brian Hales, televised in September and October 1966, paperback release date November 17th, 1988, target book number 133, cover artist Alister Pearson, a 17th century Cornish town. Villainous pirates roam the seas searching for treasure, while the townspeople have turned to smuggling, wheeling, and dealing in contraband. Into this wild and remote place, the TARDIS materializes, and the Doctor and his companions find themselves caught up in the dubious activities of the locals. When the Doctor is unwittingly given a clue to the whereabouts of the treasure, the pirates are determined to extract the information, whatever the cost. And just a quick programming note, the music in the War Games trailer that I played for Jim earlier is an excerpt from Dies Irae, which is also best known as the opening music to one of my favorite movies of all time, Battle Royale. After all, what is the War Games but a Battle Royale? And now back to our show. With John Wiles and Donald Tosh both quitting Doctor Who in respective fits of pique halfway through the production of Season 3, the new creative team of producer Innes Lloyd and script editor Jerry Davis took over and started to remake the show in their own image. More contemporary and futuristic stories, more realistic monsters based in science, a harder science fiction edge. There's a remarkable run of stories spanning the end of Season 3 through the middle of Season 4. The Season 3 TV finale, The War Machines, directed with stunning modernity by young Michael Ferguson. Once upon a time, the production assistant waving a sink plunger at whom Jacqueline Hill directed her scream in Doctor Who's first great cliffhanger. The first story from production Season 4, The 10th Planet, directed by the great Derek Martinez, which featured realistic spaceflight and introduced the Cybermen. And the first Patrick Troughton story, The Power of the Daleks, the first Dalek story not written or co-written by Terry Nation and directed by the great Christopher Barry. What a run of stories, and what a creative triumph for Lloyd and Davis. The War Machines, The 10th Planet, The Power of the Daleks, heading for the 70s, living in the 60s, screaming in a back room waiting for the big boom, as someone once said. But then in the middle of that is The Smugglers, and as Jim and I discussed earlier, you can see why Davis and Lloyd got rid of historicals so soon after this. Now, The Smugglers is a fun little story. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Friend of the show, Michael Storm, has pointed out to me, over text message, that The Smugglers owes a debt to the Alfred Hitchcock film adaptation of Jamaica Inn, with Paul Whitson-Jones's Squire, in this one, bearing a silhouette resemblance to Charles Lawton in that one, although Michael also points out that the Hitchcock film adaptation of Jamaica Inn does not bear much relation to the Daphne du Maurier novel. But while The Smugglers is a fun delicacy if you're watching Doctor Who on shuffle or in jukebox order, I think Jim and I both agree it doesn't work in the middle of War Machines and 10th Planet and Power of the Daleks before and after it. It becomes a sad little irrelevancy, a little comedy of manners, viewable only as blurry telesnaps, so we have no idea if Episode 4, as directed by Julia Smith, owed more to Douglas Fairbanks and Robert Newton than a bunch of static and fuzzy screenshots of John Ringham and Michael Godfrey looking off camera. And believe it or not, in publication order, as far as the books go, this is only the third Terrance Dicks adaptation of a William Hartnell story, following Unearthly Child and the Dalek Invasion of Earth, both of which were long, long ago in the publication schedule. Now, if you're reading in story order, there's a fourth, Planet of Giants, but that has not yet been covered from this podcast's perspective. That makes this book only Terrance's second historical in 15 years of writing Doctor Who novelizations. Now, and if you count the Tribe of Gum segments from Unearthly Child to be historical, I do, that would be his first historical otherwise. So the book is then an oddity, the Doctor that Dicks didn't write much for, in a genre that Dicks didn't write much for. The prose style of the book is Terrance's standard. I'd use the word simple, though Nigel Robinson didn't seem to like when I said that. I assume Terrence was working from whatever draft script survived in the archives, because while the TV dialogue for Ben and Polly is pretty much word for word the same looking at Chapter 1, Hartnell's dialogue is different in print. Now, Jim touched on this earlier in the show. This is the last production story of Season 3, so in a sense it is Hartnell's last work as series lead, with Patrick Troughton taking over 4 weeks into the Season 4 production block. Maybe Hartnell's recall for scripts just isn't there anymore. The scanner. That's what I call a scanner up there. The flub, if that is a flub in Episode 1, is not remotely in the book. No lines like it. So if the book comes from the scripts, that line on TV must be a desperate ad-lib by Hartnell, watching his train of thought depart from the platform. That's to borrow a line from Christopher H. Bidmead's novelization of Logopolis. Now, Smugglers is a quick 124-page book. It moves along, and it tells the story without slow expository passages or pretentiously deep bits of inner thought process. And of course, for Terrence, there are no run-on sentences. Terrence on automatic pilot is better than a lot of other late 80s Target authors. He is not reinventing the series, but he's taking a story that virtually no reader in 1988 would have known thing one about, and he makes the book fun. And Alister Pearson's cover art, well, this is the kind of picture you want to climb into and walk around in. The night sky, over the pirate ship, blending into Hartnell's black frock coat, unleashes something primal in me. What kind of church warden keeps a barrel of brandy in his vestry? Terrence has the Doctor reflect about Holy Joe Longfoot in Chapter 2. As always, Terrence's real storytelling skills are in the margins. Jim Allenby points out he doesn't give us a lot of character bios here, not the way that a Malcolm Hulk would have done for sure, but observations like these are what I live for. Now, I'm not going to read all of those bits of Chapter 2, but this is Terrence's observational skills turned up to the max. We get a description of the man, Holy Joe, with Polly thinking, quote, there was an air of shabby respectability about him, the feeling that he was playing some kind of role. Later, the Doctor notices that it clearly wasn't Holy Joe's first visit to the brandy barrel that day. But Polly realizes that he, quote, met with very little kindness and courtesy in his life. There is enough here for a 300-page biography of the ex-pirate turned church warden with just a few broad strokes. Changes from TV. The Doctor on TV won't touch brandy. In the book he sure does. Holy Joe gets the riddle right in the book, which Terrence DeMarney, one of very few Doctor Who actors to visit America and perform on the Twilight Zone, did not get right on TV, although see later for a note about how the riddle is portrayed in the book. Sadly, Terrence preserves the TV script's casual sexism word for word in print.
Well, my lad.
Ha ha, very funny. I do wish everyone would stop calling me lad. It does make me feel very odd.
Yes, but I think it better at the moment, my dear. What did they say to a maiden in trousers?
Probably die laughing.
You would think it funny, you and your bell-bottom sense of humour.
Oh, listen to our little Dolly Rocker Duchess there.
What's your time, dear boy?
Unusually for a 12-chapter book, Terrence moves the cliffhanger past the end of Chapter 3, the most notable thing about which is that Terrence DeMarney's drunken singing is not included. That was possibly unscripted business worked out in rehearsal. Oh, and in the book, the Doctor clocks that he's a murder suspect and tries to plot an escape from the inn, which is not evident from the surviving TV audio. In Chapter 4, Terrence laments that, quote, earlier companions, end quote, knew how to talk their way out of trouble when marooned in the past and dressed in strange clothes, but that Polly, quote, just didn't have the experience when she's being interrogated by the Charles Lawton stand-in. And history, quote, wasn't Ben's strong point, as he finds himself in the same predicament 2 pages later. Ben can only understand his and Polly's arrest in plain terms, page 42. They'd been nicked! The fine Episode 1 cliffhanger closes out Chapter 4, though, of course, this leaves much less of the book for the rest of the story.
Now you know the rest of the story.
In the words of the late, great American news commentator, Paul Harvey.
Holy Joe's dead, Captain. Dead before he'd tell his secret. What's that you say? But before he died, he spoke with this old sawbones here. Ah, The sawbones won't talk, not to me. Well, by thunder, you'll talk to me. Or my name's not Samuel Pike.
The first paragraph of Chapter 5, introducing Pike properly, shows how the Doctor really enjoys matching wits with the big bad of the serial. Quote, observant, even in moments of danger, the Doctor noticed that Pike's wasn't the usual seaman's hook, but a much more elaborate affair altogether. It was made in the shape of the blade of a soldier's pike head, a sort of combination of spearhead and barb. It was presumably a play on the captain's name, thought the Doctor, and this touch of whimsical vanity gave him a valuable clue to the man's character. So too did the pirate's fashionable clothing and curled wig, and the lavish decor of the cabin. Know your enemy, thought the Doctor. He was beginning to form a plan. Plus, of course, Terence never gets tired of describing how the Doctor takes over an interrogation. Page 46, quote, for some reason, Pike found himself answering his prisoner's questions, rather than the other way around. For some reason. Terence also describes a drinking goblet as, quote, more or less clean. Now, if this is Terence on automatic pilot, I'd love to see his brain when he's fully engaged. I get the sense he enjoyed this book a lot more than many other of his recent contracts. Of course, things crater when the character Jamaica shows up on page 52. 1988, I think, is very late in the day to be able to use the word Terence uses to describe Jamaica's skin tone. The word does appear twice in the book. A slight recovery on the next page, as Terence slyly has a 17th century Ute define what a warlock is, quote, as he knew well. The bit where Polly and Ben convince the boy he's been drafted by the devil is one of the most embarrassingly bad moments of 1960s Who, well, apart from the character of Jamaica. But these are not Terence's inventions. This is the book he was contractually obligated to deliver, and it's a little bit harder to pull an Emile Julius on these people. But Terence does remove both episode 2 references to Polly being terrified of rats, which is one slight gift he can bestow upon the story. In Chapter 6, after Polly and Ben escape from their first prison cell, don't worry, they'll each be under some form of arrest in each of their next 4 serials, Terence dryly observes that the public yard to which they escape is, quote, fortunately deserted. Embellishments in the book, but not on TV. Blake, the amazing John Ringham, oddly in a non-villainous part, refers to the smugglers' tunnels as the Devil's Stairway, and Cooper refers to his smuggling business as the Trade with a capital T. And a TV embellishment not in the book, Polly refers to Dr. Watson as What's-His-Name, a beautiful little character touch, presumably ad-libbed by Annika Wills. Other missing TV ad-libs, Terence does seem invested in giving Polly more agency and making her more like his own TV co-creation, Sarah Jane Smith. In Chapter 7 in the book, Polly blusters into the Squire's study to accuse Captain Pike, rather than as described in the online transcript for the smugglers being dragged in protesting by a manservant. In Chapter 8, Terence has Cherub wistfully imagine all the graphic ways that he could murder the revenue man, Josiah Blake, instead of him being cut free from Ben's bonds. The rest of that chapter is full of, as in the best of heist stories, every single character double-crossing or scheming to double-cross every single other character. Terence makes it clear the Doctor is playing Jamaica, and Cooper is playing the Doctor, and Pike is playing the Squire, and the Squire is playing Blake, and Blake is playing the Squire. Now that's the good stuff, and all crammed into a compact 11 pages. The back half of the story is a bit of what the kids used to dismissively call a runaround. This was a problem with earlier historicals like the Reign of Terror, where history happened on course, and the TARDIS crew were mere spectators. Now the Smugglers is not so much a historical, retelling famous things that already happened, but rather a pastiche of older pirate movies, or popular perceptions of pirate movies, like Pirates Never Said Arr, and Pirates Never Buried Treasure. But what's important in Chapter 9, in Terence's novelization, is a brand new mission statement for the show. Perhaps the first time the Doctor does something out of moral obligation to the locals. Something that never happened in Season 1 of the show, where the TARDIS crew usually, barely, escaped with their lives.
Well, we can leave this place any time we like.
We can't get down to the cave until next low tide.
Do, my child, explain yourself. Well, Doctor, in the crypt at the old church, there's this secret passage. Oh, yes, you mean that place where the revenue man came out of? Yeah, but you don't know where it leads to. Smack down to where the TARDIS is. So, all we've got to do is get back to the old church, go down a passage, and we're away, mate.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Yeah. What's the trouble, Doctor? Well, I'm afraid, my boy, we can't leave at the moment.
What? Well, why not?
Yes, well, I know it's really difficult for both you to understand, but I'm under moral obligation. Well, about what? We've got no ties here. Yeah, but it's this village. I feel that I might be responsible for its destruction, and therefore I must at least try and avoid this danger until Blake comes back. Yeah, but you heard what Blake said. We wouldn't stand a chance against Pike's mob. They're a right bunch of yobbos.
We wouldn't stand a chance.
Wouldn't we, my dear? Well, what does that mean? Well, you seem to forget, young man, that I've already met Pike, and I know something that he doesn't. The clue to the treasure.
So, the poor old church warden did tell you something.
What are you up to now? Well, I think if we are able to find that treasure first, we might be able to bargain. Well, I don't fancy it. I can't see him standing around chatting. Yes, and it's going to give us enough time for Blake to come back here and at the same time to save the people in this village.
It would be awful to do otherwise.
Oh, a right couple of nutcases you two are.
Back to the treasure for a moment. There was a historical pirate Captain Avery, but if this story is set in 1666, the real Avery would have been just 7 years old. And the real Avery's exact fate is unknown, hence the curse of the black spot. So dying with his brain rotten with rum and madness on his tongue, says Terence, page 110, would be Brian Hale's historically inaccurate fancy. Jim talked earlier about how Terence doesn't elaborate on a lot of things in the book. Page 102 features Ben using some Cockney rhyming slang, which isn't hard to figure out now. "Take a butcher's at this tombstone," said Michael Craze in a very different accent. That would have gone completely over my head in 1988, and with these books having international reach in the 80s, it would have been nice for Terence to have explained the full expression. Terence get the other Terences, DeMarney's, rhyme wrong 3 separate times. Kingwood, and Ringwood, it begins, depending on which page you depending on which page you look. Less interestingly, Terence assigns dialogue to Cherub to herald the episode 3 cliffhanger, end of chapter 10. Cherub doesn't say anything on TV. Episode 4 of The Smugglers, as directed by Julia Smith, who did interesting work to make chicken soup out of the chicken feathers that were the Underwater Menace scripts, and with this being the first Doctor Who to feature action by Havoc. This might well have been an epic action-adventure fest. We don't know, minus all but the few surviving feet of location home movies and censors footage, how this played out. Terence compresses all the episode 4 action into 2 chapters rather than the usual 3. There are some interesting points here, though. You could look at Avery's curse as the game of Avery. To lose is to win, and he who wins shall lose, which informs the first Doctor's foreknowledge in the 5 Doctors later on, but the story does seem to come down on the side of the curse being a real thing. With his dying breath, Pike transfers Avery's curse onto the Doctor, who in story terms, assuming 10th Planet follows on directly from this, not counting Steve Cole's past Doctor adventure, 10 Little Aliens, which fits in between the two, the first Doctor will be dead within 24 hours of Avery's curse being put on him. Oddly, Terence misses a chance to lead in to the next epic story, the way he did at the end of the novelization of An Unearthly Child, and the way he will do when we reach the end of the Planet of Giants book. There is no mention here that the next story on introduces not only the Doctor's second greatest enemies, but also his second incarnation. But of course, that is all in the past for us, as the 10th Planet novelization was way back in episode 19 of this podcast. Not for us, the pleasures of what in 2024 is the rapidly melting South Pole. No, for us. Next time, on Doctor Who Literature, we go from the second to last story of the William Hartnell era to the second story of the Sylvester McCoy era. A story that was in my bottom 5 when I first saw it, I would have seen the TV serial on PBS in 1988, but which, much to my surprise, has risen all the way to my top 60. Next week, because it is a Sylvester McCoy story, I will have 2 books to discuss with me: the novelization of that TV story, which is an adaptation of the J.G. Ballard novel High Rise. If you want to know who my 2 guests are next week, they have the same first names as the 2 participants in this week's episode. If that gives you a clue, join the 3 of us as we discuss Doctor Who, Paradise Towers. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. Each episode is produced by Jim Sangster. There's a clue. And yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed, and our YouTube channel is run by Jim Sangster, who puts up new video content every Saturday. Special thanks to my special guest, Jim Allenby from the What's in the Box podcast. This podcast can be found on your podcast app of choice, with all past episodes at creators.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.